All right, welcome to the Han Lectures 2023, and it is time for us to move to the main event. You have heard two distinguished speakers, Tess Varner and Lee McBride, speak about the work and achievements of Erin McKenna. Now, what can I say about Erin McKenna? I have known her longer than almost anybody who's outside of my family to begin with, but that does not mean that it's exactly a comfortable discussion that has gone on for the last 34 years. One of the things that I appreciate most about Erin is her ability and willingness to challenge the point of view of absolutely anybody who's talking to her. That includes me. And so whatever your point of view is, it's in some danger of being challenged this evening. And that is because Erin McKenna is a force of nature, I use Lee McBride's words, with a perspective that is indomitable and enlightening at the same time. Now, Erin went to graduate school at Purdue, and I met her there, well, it wasn't in Purdue, it was at SAP, in 1989. And since then, I have watched the development of the most extraordinary and incredible philosophical career that I could easily imagine. And so, with that said, it has gone in directions that possibly even she herself could never have forecasted, which is it began with Pragmatism and Feminism under the guidance of Charlene, Haddock, Seigfried at Purdue, and then it grew into these applied positions. Erin believes in pragmatism, and for her, pragmatism means you have to go out and do something. So instead of taking a merely theoretical interest in practical things, as most pragmatists do, she took a practical interest in practical things, and yet turned it into both philosophy and advice for the future. And so I could say a lot more because the history and the stories multiply and roll over themselves until they become snowballs. But that said, I do believe that saying that the practical things became theory and the theoretical things became practice. Mm-hmm. Pragmatism. So with that, Erin McKenna.
Thank you. So it is an honor to be here tonight, and I think the invitation mostly means that I'm old. I have been very honored to have two colleagues take my work seriously and to hear from them. Two much younger colleagues consider my work, and it's very interesting to hear about your work from the perspective of others and what they chose to focus on, because we didn't all know where we were going with this. There'll be this slideshow for a bit and then switch to another one. Some of the pictures will be talked about, so if you pay attention to them, you'll know when I get to them, and some of them probably we won't get to today. But I don't think it's good to talk about critters if you don't have the critters in the room in some way, and this is the best way to be bringing some of what we're going to talk about into the room today. I did not set out in my philosophical career to write about animals. I actually first thought that was too personal, and a series of events and being pushed by other philosophers led me to say that's exactly what I have to do, and then it has taken over, but it is consonant with the social and political philosophy I did early on. So I am going to be talking about the current work on wildlife ethics, but also what's happening, I think, is that I'm trying to argue that philosophy should always be a collaboration, not a single kind of thinker out there, and it should always be publicly engaged in one way or another if it's going to be at its best and do what it can to transform our world in ways that are important. What I'm giving you here is not some worked out final position, and I don't think that's what it will be when the book is finished, but trying to invite you into the discussion, especially Tess and I have been having about what wild means with regard to animals, get your perspectives on that, and see where that lands us. I'd kind of thought there'd be more details from the pet and livestock book, so I might stop and fill some of that in along the way, but we'll see. So I did begin to write one book about animals and pragmatism over a decade ago. That book turned into 3, and actually 4, as I realized that I needed to address different relationships humans have to companion animals, to livestock, and now to wild animals. So both as a pragmatist and a feminist, I felt I needed to start with people's closest relationships with other animals. We talk about wild animals the most for ethics, but in fact, that's not where people have their first experiences. So I've been moving. The pet books ends with, if you care about your dog or your cat, you probably need to care about the animals they eat. So that moved them to livestock, and livestock production obviously has a huge impact on wildlife. And so I'm trying to pull people into wider circles. I think that many of the problematic relationships humans have with other animals and the rest of nature is rooted in humans trying to deny their own animality and to avoid their own death. In one case, the fear of death is focused on those animals who can kill us, maybe with a bite, poisonous animals such as snakes and spiders. Attempts to exterminate rattlesnakes serve as an example of a common response to be examined and reformulated. Relatedly, fears about viruses and other mosquito and tick-borne diseases result in humans poisoning wide swaths of nature. In other cases, the fear of death results in the killing of predators whose attack humans fear. Wolves serve as a good example of human relationships with predators, but bears, foxes, coyotes, whales, eagles, and various big cats can also suffer from this human fear. Not only do humans fear direct attacks by these animal beings, they also see them as competition for prey animals and often prize them as trophies. Those animal beings seen as prey, such as bison, elk, deer, turkeys, pheasants, whales, fish, it's a long list, are animal beings that humans often kill to support their own life and lifestyle. Humans kill these animals directly for food, fiber, and trophies. In the case of species like elk and salmon, humans have moved to farming these wild species, and they're still marketed as wild, even though they're farmed. These farmed animals endanger free-living animals with disease and pollution. Relatedly, humans kill many other animals indirectly by disrupting ecosystems through predator removal, deforestation, mining, agriculture, and human encroachment. These disruptions often result in overpopulation of other animal beings who then come to be seen as pests. Deer in the absence of carnivores as one example. Or mice. We already heard about mice as pests. Many animal beings have been classified as pests: mice, rats, ants, crows, prairie dogs, seals, horses, to name a few. Humans often indiscriminately kill these animal beings, sometimes seeking to eradicate them. The case of wild horses in North America serves as an interesting example that ties together many of the issues just listed. While there were wild horses in North America in the long ago past, most living freely today are considered feral horses. From the perspective of some humans, these horses compete with livestock and prey animals for land, water, and vegetation. They are also seen as prey, hunted for meat and captured for adoption. Without the presence of other than human predators, some argue that their numbers need to be managed by killing and/or removal. Others, though, see them as an important icon of freedom, which is ironic given their complex role in the colonizing and settling of the United States. So that's the BLM corrals in Burns, Oregon. So when you see them with the tags around their neck, those are some of the captured Mustangs. In all these relationships, Western philosophical perspectives tend to put humans at the center of concern and define the other animal beings only in a limited relationship to human beings. The general framework of a pragmatist or ecofeminist shows that humans should see themselves as one among many beings embedded in complex environments. Seen only from an anthropocentric point of view causes harm to many, including humans. The interlocking nature of speciesism, sexism, racism, and classism that ecofeminists point to is important to understand. The entwined history of humans and other animals is complex. In my work, I've pointed out the ways many of our relationships with other animals mirror problematic, oppressive, and emancipatory relationships with other humans. Using ecofeminist and eco-womanist theories, I have argued that in order to address the logic of domination or colonization with regard to human relationships with other humans, we must also address the logic of domination with regard to human relationships with the earth and other animals. Now I think that focusing on human relationships with the earth and other animals may be where we need to start if we want lasting changes in relationships among humans to be possible. theories of moral extensionism usually work by moving from moral consideration for family members to larger and larger groups of humans until we theoretically include all of humanity. Then we might extend moral consideration to other animal beings who seem to be similar to humans, the large-brained social mammals such as apes, whales, and elephants. Then maybe other mammals might be included unless it's inconvenient because we want to eat them or experiment on them. Rather than centering humans and extending respect from that center, what if we decenter humans and work with a sense of shared, embodied embeddedness and relationality? Val Plumwood, who you heard a little bit about already, argues that hegemonic centrism sets up the one as primary and central and the others as secondary, derivative, and deficient. The forms of centrism that support racism, sexism, and colonialism share a common structure for Plumwood. She notes that Western philosophy and culture is androcentric, Eurocentric, ethnocentric, and anthropocentric. These all take particular experiences as privileged and representative of the whole. Other experiences and other ways of seeing or knowing are deemed less worthy and are backgrounded and suppressed. While this does obvious harm to those who are oppressed by such exclusion, it also harms those with privilege, as the narrow focus on such a partial perspective distorts the myriad interconnections among all life. It supports the illusion of disembeddedness and promotes humans' increasing remoteness from the rest of nature and each other. Anthropocentrism is rooted in the idea of human beings being both superior to and separate from the rest of nature. It is a small step to forget or ignore our dependency on healthy ecosystems, something we share with the rest of life. This then removes any sense of limits or the need for self-restraint. Plumwood argues that centric structures tend to rest on dualisms that, quote, create a sharp ontological break or radical discontinuity between the group identified as the privileged center and those subordinated. Such dualisms often result in what Plumwood calls radical exclusion, in which the other is seen as inferior and radically separate. Difference becomes deficiency. This is then used to justify domination and conquest. It also blocks sympathy with the other and any questioning of the inequalities justified by the centric position. When the other is seen as radically separate and inferior, they are also seen as inessential, and the dependency of the one in the center on the marginalized other is backgrounded and denied. Men's reliance on women's care work, a master's reliance on slave labor, humans' reliance on the rest of nature for air to breathe, as examples. Further, the colonized other is seen as having no agency. As Plumwood writes, quote, the extent to which indigenous people were ecological agents who actively managed the land, for example, is denied, and they are presented as largely passive in the face of nature. She argues that the shared logic among centric oppressions results in, quote, assimilating racially subordinated groups to women or to animals and children. Realizing this, though, allows for shared strategies of liberation that are rooted in, quote, a better understanding of human embeddedness in nature. Not treating humans as being outside of nature, Plumwood aims to challenge or disrupt conceptions of human identity and virtue based on the exclusion or devaluation of characteristics shared with non-humans, such as emotionality and embodiment. We stress instead human relatedness to and care for the natural world, she says. This includes the idea of respectful and reciprocal use, in which humans acknowledge the mindedness of the rest of nature and are available for non-human use, perhaps as food, which Tess alluded to, and Lee with the Val Plumwood and the crocodile seeing her as food and only food. It also requires an interspecies distributive justice that stresses the need to share the earth, even with what Plumwood calls the inconvenient species, such as snakes, crocodiles, and bears. And the need to adjust human behavior to make room for other beings to survive and maybe even thrive. If we don't address androcentrism, Eurocentrism, ethnocentrism, and anthropocentrism, we will likely continue to harm both human and other animal beings and the planet. For instance, the Livestock book threads the history of how most animal beings considered to be livestock came to what would become the United States with colonists, and their presence was both motivation for and method of removing Native Americans from their lands. The presence of livestock often disrupted ecosystems with overgrazing and so threatened Native people's foodways. Native Americans who killed free-roaming livestock were seen as thieves. At times, livestock were pushed into native territories in order to have the excuse of theft of property to perpetrate violence against the native peoples and against predators such as wolves and big cats. The European settlers drew on a sense of a right to self-defense for themselves even as they moved into the territories of other human and other animal beings such as wolves, bears, and cougars. They denied that same right of self-defense to Native Americans and native predator species. The various forms of centrist thinking distort relationships and make respect and reciprocity difficult to come by, and so my research is focused on places and people who exemplify very much human-centered approaches and those who try to avoid human-centered approaches. So I'm trying to look at both. My original plan included travel to a variety of places to view wildlife and to sanctuaries. Given the limits on travel thanks to COVID, which itself is likely the consequence of human disrespect for other animal life, it became clear to me that this project would benefit from working with a co-author. So I approached Mary Trachsel, who Tess has mentioned, a professor of rhetoric at the University of Iowa. While both of us have experience with captive chimpanzees, Mary has observed free-living chimpanzees in Africa. Mary has more experience with pigs, for example, captive and free-living, and much more experience with birds. In the meantime, I had begun to work on a more focused project that would help frame the wildlife ethic book. I've long been facing the issue of how to refer to the various ways humans categorize other animal beings and how these categories are then used to establish different ethical obligations. And I stuck with pets and I stuck with livestock for complex reasons that I outline in that book, and I both use and challenge how we understand those terms. And so now we were faced with the question of wild. It is common to divide other animal beings into domesticated, pets and livestock, and wild, everything else, as if they're all the same. The concept of wild is complicated and fraught and actually not very descriptive of the animal beings to whom it is applied. But it is written into law and policy and is often what gains or loses specific species protections and respect. So I approached Tess Varner, who teaches and writes on wilderness and the wild, to try to gain some clarity on how to understand and use these terms. I had always hoped to have this done before embarking on the wildlife ethics book, but the two began to take place simultaneously. So Tess joined the book project and the research trips to Yellowstone, some of which are up here, and Minnesota to see wolves and bears, and hopefully more trips to come. The three-way collaboration is proving to be fun as well as interesting and productive. Such collaboration also moves us away from the model of a single sage thinking in isolation. It actually mirrors the kind of collaborative relationships humans need to develop with the rest of nature. Mutual modification and adjustment is necessary if we want to move forward in less damaging ways with the planet and each other. A fair amount of literature in environmental ethics about the language of wilderness exists, but such work focuses primarily on the language of wildness in the context of land. It says little about how classifications like wild and other designations such as feral, tame, and domesticated shape our understandings of and our relationships with other animal beings. Wild has the connotation of being uncontrollable, even dangerous. When a human is called wild, they are seen as being out of control, lawless, uncivilized. Such humans are seen as in need of civilizing. When an animal is called wild, it too is seen as uncontrolled and dangerous in a way that contrasts them with those animal beings who have their lives and deaths closely controlled by humans. So what does that mean for elephants in a zoo? They are not domesticated, though they may be tame. We call them captive as their nature is seen as wild and free, though their body is currently confined. What does it mean for feral animals such as feral pigs in the United States? They live much more independently than the captive elephants, but are denied the designation of wild. We see their true nature as being domesticated to serve human desires for food and biomedical research. The feral pig, who behaves as a wild animal, is seen as breaking with the nature of pigs and so can be listed as a nuisance animal that needs to be eliminated. Their status as feral animals usually prevents them from achieving any kind of protected status. Because most humans see pigs primarily as food, the public does not rise to their defense. How one is seen and classified limits or opens up possibilities. So too with the ways humans have classified other humans. Primitive, advanced, wild, civilized, heathen, God-fearing. We refer to feral children who haven't had enough parental control. They have, quote, run wild and are seen as more animal than human. But humans are animals, so why so much emphasis on these distinctions? Claire Palmer's view of how to understand the spectrum from domesticated to wild is often used in wildlife discussions. In her 2010 book, Animal Ethics in Context, Palmer takes wildness to be, quote, something is wild in a certain respect to the extent that it is not humanized in that respect. She differentiates constitutive wildness, locational wildness, and dispositional or behavioral wildness. These should be understood on a spectrum, she says, which allows different animal beings to be more or less wild in each of these ways. Since Palmer's work is often cited in work on wildlife ethics, it's important that we discuss it. But since Palmer argues that on a relational approach to animal ethics, humans generally only have obligations to domesticated or humanized animal beings, Tess and I have some concerns about how she understands the relationships among various humans and other animals. For Palmer, constitutive wildness takes wildness to be concerned with human control of bodies and breeding. Wild animal beings are those who have not been bred in human captivity with an eye to producing specific traits, usually for economic profit. They are not subject to human mastery in the sense of humans controlling their place, movements, activities, and food. She arrives at A, not being selectively bred, B, not being adapted to live alongside humans. That's an important one, not being adapted to live alongside humans. C, not being adapted for human use or purpose. Zoo animals, for instance, might be domesticated in terms of A, not being selectively bred, but not B and C. Palmer does note that some animal beings may be affected genetically by human activities such as culling, but not be seen as domesticated. The Kiger Mustangs are a good example of this, and I will discuss them more later. And those are Kiger Mustangs right now. So any of the horses not in a BLM corral on this slideshow are Kiger Mustangs from Oregon. Palmer discusses the problems of constitutive wildness for conservation efforts. Does captive breeding for the purposes of reintroducing some individuals of a species back into a wild place, by definition mean that those animals are domesticated? And we have the condors or the Mexican wolf project as examples. What about backbreeding in order to create versions of extinct species, breeding heck cattle to produce something like an auroch for rewilding projects? Locational wildness takes wildness to be concerned with place. For Palmer, wild places are those not cultivated by humans and sit at one end of a wild developed continuum. Wild animal beings, then, are those who live in wild places or wilderness. They do not live near humans or in places that have much impact by humans, but we have hawks living in Lee's backyard. Historical wildness means that humans were not involved in the making of a place. It can be lost by the unintentional introduction of species or the intentional management of a place, which we've talked about a bit. Compositional wildness involves the species that would be present in a place without human involvement. In this case, if humans reintroduce a species that would have been there historically, compositional wildness is maintained even as a historical wildness is lost, as humans were involved in the making of the place. Dispositional or behavioral wildness takes wildness to be concerned with behavior toward human beings on a wild-tame spectrum. She's very clear. It's not about general behavior. It's the animal's behavior toward human beings. For Palmer, while tame animal beings are generally comfortable around human beings, wild animal beings are fearful of human beings and may be aggressive toward them. She later calls this self-willed wildness, which is animals doing their own thing. Her examples reveal the complexity of this with regard to the wild domesticated distinction. Wolves in captivity who cannot express their natural hunting behavior are not self-willed, but are not domesticated or tamed. Domesticated cats who are tame and depend on humans could be wild in this sense if they are allowed to hunt. She states that self-willed refers to things changing and developing independently of human control. This then allows for another continuum of those animal beings wild in more or fewer of these senses. She gives the example of a city squirrel who is constitutively wild but not locationally wild, and whose behavior may or may not be considered wild. All of this centers the other animal beings in relation to or non-relation to human beings. and makes humans and human territory somehow unnatural. For pragmatism and for Plumwood, they start with the idea that the human life is on a continuum with the rest of life. Further, human culture is not in a binary relationship with nature, but is formed through interactions, or Dewey's sense of transactions, with nature. Culture and nature are mutually modifying and interdependent. Humans and other animal beings have always been in a process of mutual modification through hunting, observation, and various forms of contact. Interestingly, Palmer does note that a domesticated dog might be fearful or aggressive with regard to humans, but she understands that as a creation of humans' behavior towards such a dog, and not something about the constitutive domesticatedness of the dog. But why wouldn't this apply to non-domesticated animal beings as well? Darwin noted the lack of fear of humans in the various animal beings he saw on the Galapagos Islands. Such fear has often been considered instinctual, but is much more likely to have developed through contact with humans who hunted or otherwise harmed or harassed various animal beings. Humans emerged alongside and after most of the animal species. To say that wild animals are naturally fearful of humans and not meant to live alongside humans makes no sense. This kind of view gave some humans an outsized sense of themselves, and they stopped living in relation. They decided that some animals shouldn't live near humans and started to try to eliminate those that they feared. Bears' aggression toward humans, for instance, often comes after humans have perpetrated violence on a specific bear population. Deer flee humans more in times and places where hunting is taking place. Whales become more fearful of and aggressive toward human beings in times and places of intensive whaling. The fear and aggression that is supposed to separate the wild from the tame seems likely to be human-caused, and in most cases, and so does not seem like a good way to try and differentiate our relationships. To explore her relational ethic, Palmer is most interested in those animal beings who live near humans but are not domesticated. Living in what she calls the contact zone, those animal beings are not domesticated or fully wild in the senses she has described. Donaldson and Kimlicka call these liminal animals. She also discusses feral animals who, as a species in the past, had their bodies and breeding controlled by humans, but who either were abandoned or escaped human captivity and now live without human control, though they may scavenge from humans as some feral dogs and cats do. These animals are important for Palmer because they are not at a distance from humans, even as they are not domesticated. Since our responsibilities for her are connected to the closeness and dependence of domesticated animals, she builds the case for not assisting wild animal beings, at least in part due to constitutive wildness involving bodily distance from humans, and locational wildness involving a physical distance from human impacts. But if we reject this idea of human absence or distance being what makes something wild, which I think as a pragmatist and ecofeminist I do, then this ethical distinction won't hold. Most recently, I've been reading a lot on wild horses, prairie dogs, wolves, and bears. It is a constantly changing literature as the status of these animals changes constantly. Wolves are protected, not protected, protected again. We also began the work of going out into the field. We shouldn't just think about these issues, we need to experience them and the various animal beings we are discussing. I think philosophy needs to grow out of and be informed by the experiences we have with the world and with those outside of philosophy. So in September of 2021, I went to Diamond, Oregon to ride out and see the Kiger Mustangs. On the way, I stopped at the BLM Wild Horse Holding Facility in Burns. Interestingly, despite past destruction of that facility by animal activists, you can just drive around the corrals. So there we are again. While cared for, it seems that these horses are living in large groups in spaces that are too small to allow for some important natural behaviors and natural movement. Given current policies, these horses may exist under these conditions for the rest of their lives. A roundup of the Kiger Mustangs was scheduled for fall 2022, but did not happen. Since the Kigers are popular, though, when the next roundup occurs, it is likely that all uninjured horses will be adopted. But in every roundup, some animals are killed and many are injured. So as rain rolled in, as I finished going around the corrals, rain started to come in, and I continued my drive to Diamond, Oregon, which has a population of 3. The weather was welcome as the area desperately needed rain, but it meant the ride out to see the Mustangs would be delayed a day. a reminder of how we are shaped and controlled by nature despite our efforts not to be. So the next day, I spent the morning sitting on the hotel's screened-in porch, drinking tea and reading about Mustangs. I then took advantage of a break in the weather to drive the Steens Mountain Loop Road to see Mustangs. And so when you see some of the paints, those are the Steens Mountain Band. On this drive, you climb to almost 10,000 feet. It is a 60-mile drive that takes 3 to 5 hours. After a harrowing drive, I finally started to see manure piles. My first thought was that people were riding horses along the road, but then I noticed the height of some of the manure piles and started to be on the lookout for Mustangs. It wasn't long before a few bands came into sight, and I decided the drive had probably been worth it. These were horses from the Steens Mountain South herd. I didn't feel I could linger that day. I did on another trip, because the weather was changing and rain and wind were clearly on their way. When I finally got back to the main road, I thought my car literally would be lifted up into the heavens. The rain was pounding and the wind was coming from all directions. I literally would see a tumbleweed go one way and then go the other way. So I was very happy to get back to the hotel and return to my spot in the screened-in porch, this time with a beer. That was it. So the next day, we drove out to the BLM Kiger Mustang Herd Management Area. I was mounted on River, who is an adopted Mustang, and so when you see a saddled horse here, that would be River. While we kept an eye out for horses, the dogs who were with us found and chased a group of pronghorn antelope, and they got in trouble for chasing wild animals. After just over an hour, we saw a few horses up on a rise, and we headed in that direction. As we climbed a parallel hill, a herd of about 80 horses came into sight. Since the BLM claims a carrying capacity of 20 to 30 horses for the area, this was a large herd. Since they hadn't been rounded up in some time, they were not skittish, and we dismounted and watched. So those are the Steens Mountain herd right there. Lucky was the lead stallion of this group, and he's called Lucky because they are desperate to capture him because he doesn't have the right genetics, and every roundup he doesn't get captured. So Lucky was there with several bands who had come together. Of particular interest to me was a group of 3 bachelors who you'll see looking at us. They were very interested in us. And after we had lunch, we decided to ride down the hill and try and circle around behind the herd and watch from there. As we began to go on the other side, though, the 3 bachelors came galloping toward us, and the rest of the herd got up. Many had been resting. Our guide, Tim O'Crowley, said they were getting ready to move, so those are the 3 bachelors, yeah. So they were getting ready to move, and we should just give them a really wide berth, and maybe we could get around and watch them some more. Once we were well around them and headed back downhill, all of a sudden the 3 bachelors were once again galloping toward us. We stopped. A few minutes later, the whole herd went galloping across in front of us and up another rise. Once they were well up the hill, the 3 bachelors slowly moved off, keeping an eye on us the whole time. They seemed partly protective and partly curious. About halfway back to the trailer, I looked up toward a bluff, and there was one horse standing and watching us. It felt like we were being escorted out and watched to make sure we left the area. It was an amazing experience, but one that shows many complex entanglements among the various animal beings involved. The horse I had ridden, River, was an adopted Mustang, not a domesticated horse. I trusted him and his footing on our steep climb down the mountain and the gallop we had over rocks, more than I would have trusted my own horses, who don't have River's experiences. The horses we were riding also work cattle who compete with the wild horses for grazing. So do the pronghorn antelope, whom humans like to hunt, and the dogs were punished for chasing the antelope in the same way they're actually asked to herd cattle. Having not recently been harassed by humans, the wild horses we watched seemed curious about us and comfortable within limits. It certainly helped that we rode out on horses and not motorized vehicles. In a way, the horses we rode were cultural mediators who enabled us a certain kind of contact. The wild horses are free to roam, but roads, fences, and natural boundaries set limits. They are free to breed, but their genetics is managed. They are protected, but their protection rests in large part on their popularity and high adoption rate. So they really confuse a lot of those categories Palmer tries to present. Wild horses in the U.S. are considered to be feral, even though they are referred to as wild. Since they symbolize the supposed freedom and independence of the U.S. West, many in the general public see them as wild. But what about horses like the Kiger Mustangs? This group is confined by humans into a specific territory. They are regularly gathered and culled to maintain certain genetics and particular physical characteristics, the Spanish look. They are now a recognized breed, with many members of the breed having been adopted and now seen as domesticated. How does that impact the status of Kiger Mustangs who live most of their lives without humans? While the Kiger Mustangs present some unique issues, even less managed herds of wild horses are classified as feral and as an introduced species in the U.S., even though the evolution of horses began in North America. This would make wild horses a reintroduced species, whose evolutionary history makes them a good fit for the current territories they inhabit. How long does it take to regain wildness in the eyes of humans? Without that status, they aren't allowed to live in most national parks or to be considered for protected status under the 1973 Endangered Species Act. The limited protections provided under the 1971 Wild Horse and Burro Act actually may be doing them more harm than good. The act forbids relocating them to public lands where they presently do not exist, and it allows for controlling their numbers for the integrity of the land and other wildlife. These two elements result in a great deal of pressure on wild horses and burros. First, they lost potential territory when they were killed prior to the original act going into effect. So when the act was about to go into effect, there was massive hunting to make sure there were no horses in certain territories, so they couldn't claim that territory for them. So now they are isolated to small island-like territories. They are blamed for putting pressure on the same land. Two things are worth considering. One, were they allowed to roam more freely, they might well put less pressure on particular land. Two, horses and burros are blamed for overgrazing despite the fact that they are far outnumbered by grazing livestock animals. And little to no data is used to support the claim that they endanger watersheds and general environmental conditions. Horses are intelligent social animals who have been shaped by being prey for human and other animals. They mark territory by urinating and defecating in stud piles, but are constantly on the move within their territory unless fences and other obstacles block their way. Early on in North America, free-roaming horses and bison were targeted for removal as part of the campaign to remove Native Americans from their lands. There's River. There he is. As non-native settlers spread across what is now the United States, livestock animals came with them, the cows and sheep grazing on land once the territory of horses and bison, and the bison having been almost completely eliminated, the horses came to be seen as the main grazing competition, and they were targeted for removal. In 1919, the U.S. government ordered the Crow peoples to reduce their number of horses to benefit non-native ranchers who were grazing cattle on reservation land. When the Crow peoples refused, the government paid $4 a horse to hired killers, and within 3 years, 40,000 Crow horses had been killed. Western grasses and horses, you can see them again. Western grasses and horses developed together in the ancient past and are still well adapted to each other. But they are seen by many, the BLM and ranchers in particular, as an invasive species. As a consequence of being seen as invasive pests, they are treated like coyotes and prairie dogs and considered varmints. The government created an open season on horses. In 1893, Nevada allowed them to be shot on sight. Those who made a living killing wolves were happy to kill other offending creatures. They would often kill horses and then wait for wolves or mountain lions to arrive at the carcass and kill them as well. Horse carcasses were also poisoned, leading to indiscriminate killing of all sorts of animals. Another way to eliminate the pest horses was to profit from them. In 1895, Portland, Oregon had a processing plant devoted to the slaughter and processing of horses, and in 1911, a Colorado group produced soap, had a contract to round up Mustangs for $5 a head. In 1919, Congress changed laws to allow for the federal inspection of horse meat, and this resulted in more canneries opening. In the 1920s, when there were still around 2 million Mustangs, they were rounded up, killed, and used for dog food. By 1925, 200 horses were being processed each day for this purpose. Horsehide was used for baseballs, Randy, and coats. Horse byproducts were used in chicken feed and fertilizer. These uses of horses were taking place during a time of increased interest in the welfare of animals, though. In 1866, the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals was founded, and 1877 saw the founding of the American Humane Society, which became the U.S. Humane Society in 1954. When the Chappell Brothers dog food plant in Illinois used Rin Tin Tin in commercials, the Humane Society objected. An early advocate for Mustangs, Francis Litt, tried to blow up the Chappell Brothers plant. By 1925, the cause of animal rights was more than a fringe issue, and Litz gained public sympathy. Meanwhile, Chappell Brothers expanded to Montana and Wyoming and continued to slaughter horses. While in 1930 the U.S. processed tens of millions of pounds of horse meat, by 1938 they processed less than 2 million. It was too hard to get to the remaining horses to make it profitable. One author notes, quote, "Like so many businesses, it was only designed to flourish with unbridled plenty. It never invested in sustaining its resources. It just made money while it was there for the making, and when it was over, it closed up shop." They started to use planes to hunt horses in Oregon in 1938. Wild Horse Annie helped pass a Nevada bill which banned mechanized hunting, but with an exception for federal lands. Since so much of Nevada land is federal land, the ban did nothing really to help the Mustangs, and there were no prosecutions for over a decade. By 1970, the BLM reported only 10,000 free-roaming horses left. Today, that number is about 85,000, with almost as many, 55,000, held in government facilities. Today, horses exist on 10% of public lands, while cattle graze on 65%. So much money is spent on holding and feeding horses that the BLM has trouble funding roundups and making range improvements. This means fewer native plants and many animals suffer. Antelope, bighorn sheep, jackrabbits, butterflies, a long list. After the 1971 Wild Horse and Burro Act, the BLM is now seen by many as the enemy of the rancher and blamed for unleashing the horse on cattle ranchers. After the government spent a great deal of money to kill a variety of wild animals on behalf of ranchers, horses, wolves, grizzlies, mountain lions, and coyotes, the government is now seen as having done nothing for these ranching communities. By some estimates, the BLM spends $36 million on predator control and receives $15 million for grazing rights, so the budgets don't really add up. Given these costs, corruption in the BLM, there was a whole scandal of BLM employees adopting wild horses that were sent to slaughter, and mismanagement in the system, continuing roundups and adoptions does not seem like a good long-term strategy. Neither is allowing uncontrolled reproduction of Mustangs on the limited land left for them to use. Many wild horse advocates champion birth control, but some animal rights advocates object. One sample herd project showed that birth control cost $110 a year, while roundups cost $50,000. The BLM continues to not adopt the birth control approach due to their fear of reprisal from animal groups, given their past history. The main issue for these groups is that while birth control works, its use taints the symbol of wildness. Another option to limit horses' numbers is to increase mountain lion numbers in the areas where the horses live. Big cats are natural predators for horses, preying mainly on foals. They are so effective that PZP was discontinued in the prior mountain herd one year when cats killed all the foals from that year. In response to that killing of the foals, the human hunting of the cats was encouraged. As recently as 2014, over 300 mountain lions were killed by the government and 280 by private hunters. In many places, we both round up horses and kill mountain lions. Using an animal labeled as obnoxious and with a bounty on their head, the cats, to control numbers in a species considered to be by many to be a pest has its tensions and ironies, but it makes more sense than killing both species at great expense. Okay, this is where I want to change, if we can do this. Uh-oh. Do I have to stop sharing to change?
No, you should. You can just stop that slideshow at the bottom.
There we go. So that you get the prior mountains on this one as well. So another, and our bathroom research too. We'll talk about that another time. Another strategy has been for the government to pay ranchers to become long-term sanctuaries for captured Mustangs. Mary Trachsel and I visited one such sanctuary in June 22, the Wind River Wild Horse Sanctuary. This sanctuary is located on the Wind River Indian Reservation just outside of Lander, Wyoming. They work with the BLM to provide a permanent free-roaming environment for over 200 Mustangs. We were taken in a gator out in a very wet field of geldings. Many of the horses came right up to the vehicle, but others remained skittish. We were told that a film crew had recently been there and the horses had been run for the purposes of filming so that they would seem free. And so they were still a bit wary of people entering the field. These are the prior mountains, anywhere you see snow. Most of the horses looked to be in good health, but there was one horse who was noticeably lame. We were told that the horses are left on their own except for being fed some minerals to make up for the leaching of minerals due to the flood irrigation. They are not provided veterinary care or hoof trimming and are not handled. This sanctuary is a less confined holding facility than the one we saw in Burns, but it is nonetheless a permanent holding facility for wild horses. None of those horses are up for adoption. There are only a few such eco-sanctuaries, and they cost as much or sometimes more than the BLM holding corrals. They're supposed to engage in ecotourism, like our visit, to offset that cost. The horses are less confined than at the corrals, but they are still sex segregated and not living in family groups. All of these horses have gone through the trauma of roundup and capture and have been separated from their family groups and larger herds. The family bonds and social organization of Mustangs is an important part of their lives. And that became even clearer on the second trip Mary and I took to see the Kiger Mustang herd and a trip to see the Pryor Mountain Mustangs. So Mary and I joined another ride out to the Kigers in June 2022, hoping to see foals, which we did. Lucky was there with a mare, a foal, and a yearling, and there were other foals as well. When we first rode up to the herd, they were pretty spread out. Lucky and his band were off by themselves, and there was a big group under a tree. There were a few scattered small groupings, and a lone stallion was roaming around the edges. There were pronghorn antelope grazing just behind the herd. Seeing us ride up, the lone stallion began pushing the scattered groups to the big band and kept trying to get Lucky's family to join them as well. Lucky and his family did finally come close to the big group under the tree, but continued to stay a bit separate. Most of the horses were in a circle facing the big tree to enjoy the shade. Slowly, some small groups splintered off again to enjoy the shade of smaller nearby trees. A group of juvenile males began to form, and they ran off some ways from the rest of the horses. They were at some distance, but we could watch them through binoculars. They ran and reared, play fighting for some time before they galloped out of sight in the direction of a watering hole, and we never saw them again. Other small groups were also drifting. Did the horses come up on that one? Yeah. They did? Okay, I'm hoping I didn't get the wrong one. We didn't see them again. Other small groups also began drifting in the direction of the water, but not in any great hurry. No one really wanted to leave, and we probably watched the herd and the antelope for a couple of hours. During that time, the conversation was often about Gash, who had had what they thought were mountain lion scratches on his hindquarters. He seemed to be healing well, and they thought he probably received his scratches defending the herd's new foals. Tim had thought there might be a mountain lion nearby during our fall ride because his horse became very nervous at one point, so they're definitely part of the Kiger Mustang's life. But predation does not keep the numbers of this herd within the improved numbers for the management area. So there will be another gather at some point. When that happens, about a sixth of the number of horses we saw that day would be returned to the area. The smaller number, along with their increased skittishness, will make them harder to find. Many people travel to the area to see the Kiger Mustangs and the wild horses on nearby Steens Mountain. The horses were not in poor health in either the fall, during a drought, or the spring. The herd had foals, showing them to be healthy enough to reproduce, and they share the area with large herds of pronghorn, antelope, and cattle. It is not clear that demands to thin the herd are warranted. Our next stop was to see wild birds and other wildlife at the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge headquarters just south of Burns. These headquarters are the place of the FBI standoff with the Bundys in 2014. Part of what was at stake in that standoff was the earlier tension the Bundys had faced over not paying grazing fees for the cattle they graze on public lands in Nevada. Given their notoriety for that, they came to Burns to support a father and son, the Hammonds, who were being tried for unauthorized burning of BLM lands they leased for grazing. In both these cases, the focus on public land being cheaply or freely available to ranchers to graze livestock put pressure on land the wild horses must share. And this is why the BLM sets herd limits. The Kiger Mustang herd is now estimated at about 180 and is considered overdue for roundup and culling. Seth said he didn't know if the BLM would gather them or not. He thought they faced criticism no matter what they did. Ranchers wanted the herd smaller, some wanted it gone, while animal rights groups opposed the gathers and some opposed the use of birth control. If mountain lions are not numerous enough to keep the herd within the carrying capacity of the management area, then some other measures eventually will need to be used to keep the land healthy. Local ranchers are unlikely to tolerate an increase in the mountain lion population, and some animal rights activists don't like the idea of horses being eaten by mountain lions, including my co-author Mary Trachsel, who also has horses, and so we're We're arguing about that as we speak. Removing the cattle that graze there might allow for a larger herd of horses, but it wouldn't allow for unchecked growth. The Kiger Mustangs are popular and have high adoption rates, so it's likely they'll continue to be gathered and adopted out. This can apply to the Pryor Mountain herd as well. Given the popular films about the stallion Cloud, which some of you may have seen, the Pryor Mountain is quite popular. They are protected by being on the first protected refuge exclusively for horses established in 1968. Websites and blogs were devoted to keeping up with the herd. They are known as individuals, getting back to Lee's point, so when they come up for adoption, much is known about that particular horse's history. It is also possible to visit the herd if one is willing to brave the conditions of what they just say is unimproved BLM and U.S. Forest Service roads. It is far worse than unimproved. It is huge boulders next to cliffs. So Mary and I found ourselves in the hands of Nancy and Steve Cerrone from the Pryor Mountain Wild Mustang Center in Lovell, Wyoming, as we climbed up to their alpine range, which is what you're seeing there. There were a number of foals, some just a few days old. On our way up, Nancy talked about how she came to do this work as we listened to Ian Tyson sing about wild horses. We were joined in our vehicle by a woman who comes out from New York every summer to see the Pryor Mountain herd, stopping in Teddy Roosevelt Park to see the horses there on her drive. She found her time with the horses healing, and she focused on photographing them, as many of the visitors do. Eventually, we saw 2 horses. Nancy told us they were a family who had lost a foal last year and had no foal this year. We then saw another small group a short distance away. Up ahead, there was a long line of ATVs, and we started seeing horses everywhere. We saw another small family, stallion, mare, and newborn foal. There was concern that the foal had some discharge coming from her nose or mouth, but she repeatedly got up and nursed. As we continued on, we saw a stallion raise an alarm and run his band over a hill. No one saw what worried him, but he did this several more times during our time with them. We drove on to get by the press of vehicles. There were lots of people focused on the newborn foal and found a place to park and get out. Nancy told us that the horses get more restless when the ATVs come by because they sound like helicopters. But for the most part, the horses seem relaxed and unconcerned with all the people watching them. As we walked out into the wilderness study area, which you should see a sign for that, we tried to keep our distance from the horses. They did not share in those distancing rules. We would repeatedly find ourselves too close to some horses and needing to map a way around. It was good to have a guide who knew all the individuals and families around us. A few times Nancy advised against walking through what seemed like an open space, as that would put us between family members. At one point, we heard a lot of calling between 2 groups of mares. Nancy told us these mares had recently been separated into 2 groups by one stallion taking some mares from another. As they called and approached each other, the 2 stallions met at a stud pile and began posturing. Has that been on there? I'm thinking I have the wrong slideshow, but we can work on that. So they began posturing. They sniffed, defecated, struck out at each other, and reared up. They then each walked back to their respective groups of mares and foals. I was struck by how the stallions' behavior was exactly like that of my 2 geldings when they are turned out together. In fact, for people who live and work with domesticated horses, watching wild horses can seem not unlike watching domesticated horses turned out into a field. The main difference is the family structures. Here we were seeing families of males, females, and youngsters. There were bachelor males on the fringes, as with the Kigers, and everyone had a role to play. In domesticated settings, there is usually sex segregation, as there is in the BLM corrals and sanctuaries. It is this family structure that makes the wild horses so distinctive. And it is the family structure that is disrupted by roundups and adoptions. It's less disrupted by birth control. The Pryor Mountain Mustang Center has advocated for birth control, and Nancy has received pushback from animal rights groups. Unlike some other birth control efforts, though, with the Pryor Mountain herd, the horses are rounded up and then the birth control administered, so it doesn't avoid the stress and potential injuries of the roundup and the family separations. There they are at the stud pile. We continued to watch the horses at a water hole, jockeying for access, and then had lunch while horses wandered nearby. We heard many comments from people outside our group that these horses didn't seem wild at all. Some sarcastically remarked that they should have brought their saddles along. While we saw signs indicating we were in a wilderness study area, and these horses are designated as wild and free roaming, the horses' ease with the high volume of human visitors made it appear to many humans that there is nothing wild about the place or the horses. Given Palmer's definitions discussed earlier, it would be hard to see these horses as wild. Little fear of humans, some human control of breeding, human presence in their territory. If you were paying attention, though, you could see the self-willed individuality of the horses and the bonds of family and friendship. While this is also evident among domesticated horses, humans rarely respect those bonds, and I discuss that some in the pet book. Here, the humans were expected to respect those bonds. They also have to respect the natural course of events. No interventions for injuries or disease. Nancy was at pains to photograph one stallion who was hiding in some trees with a few mares. He had been injured during a fight when he fell on a rock and had a big gash on his rear end. Nancy was happy to see how it was healing. But not all herds have the same kind of popularity of the Kyger and Pryor mountain herds, and many wild horses end up living much of their life in a corral. In addition to the long-term eco-sanctuaries, there are some Mustangs who end up in prison programs that work to train them and get them ready for adoption. In fact, the film crew that had been at the Wind River Wild Horse Sanctuary just before our visit was a 60 Minutes film crew that was doing a story on a wild horse prison program in Wyoming that began in 1988. Their website notes that working with the horses, quote, plays an important role in inmate rehabilitation, as it provides an opportunity to learn how to respect animals and people through day-to-day challenges. Respect is a life skill that many inmates need help developing while incarcerated. Inmates working with horses learn that through hard work, respect, communication, and patience, even a wild animal will respond in a positive manner. The horses are also seen to gain from the program as the training there makes them more adoptable. Implied here is that if a wild animal can learn to be respectful and responsive to commands, so too can a wild human. Both the inmates and the horses have been considered wild and or feral. Both are seen as in need of gentling or taming. Both have lost their freedom of movement and association. This loss is, in the end, supposed to lead to having them be better or more productive beings if they cooperate and set aside their wildness. Something similar is seen when people, coming from the U.S. in particular, travel to other countries and encounter street dogs or feral dogs. Assuming these dogs would prefer to live with a specific set of humans in a house, they often rescue these dogs and bring them home. While it is likely that their lives are longer, it is not always clear that their lives are better in all regards. This is one case, though, where the pedigree of the dog doesn't matter. In many cases, the worth of a dog monetarily or existentially rests upon their breeding. While with dogs, mutts have gained in popularity and hybrid vigor is championed, it is still the case that one of the first questions people have when meeting a dog is, what are they? The same holds true for horses, but even more so. While there is some intentional crossbreeding with horses, there is still talk about each line in such a breeding. The overwhelming majority of horses now are purebred, even though all breeds began with some kind of cross. There emerges a kind of aristocracy within a breed. Certain lines or individuals are prized and elevated above the rest. This means some small subset of horses command high prices for themselves or their sperm or their offspring. They are pampered with the best care and cared for in retirement. Most of the other horses are not so blessed and may be repeatedly sold on rather than have any physical or psychological needs addressed. When old or lame, they are often sold to slaughter, now having to make the trek to Canada or Mexico since horse slaughter plants in the U.S. have been closed. One reason the plants were closed was due to the pressure from animal advocates who wanted to stop the possibility of any Mustangs being slaughtered for food. So now all horses have to travel further. And this is one of the reasons the BLM is often caring for horses that are warehoused for a lifetime. Animal advocates have worked hard to get the public to value Mustangs, whether they are free roaming or are adopted. However, within the horse world, their value is limited. There are stories of individual Mustangs doing well in a particular discipline, but they are the exception. And there is a clear preference for other specific breeds of horses for particular work. Even though Mustangs are valued as trail and ranch horses, they haven't made a dent in the overwhelming dominance of quarter horses for this work. Mustangs are deemed more adoptable if they have some training. In addition to prison programs, trainer challenges are also popular. These pay selected trainers to work with Mustangs for a short amount of time to get them under saddle. While this may land the horses a home, Rushing such work does not serve the horse well in the long run. Even with such efforts, the Mustangs with Spanish blood are valued over Mustangs which mirrors the same kind of hierarchy found in the rest of the world. My point here is that while we are trying to protect a variety of animals, often it's the case that being wild means being valued less, and the same can be said for being a wild human. If we want to change how society understands and approaches human beings who are seen as uncontrollable, lawless, or lacking breeding, we need to start by changing how human beings understand and relate to other animal beings. The habits of how humans understand, categorize, and relate to other animals has always spilled over to how humans understand, categorize, and relate to other humans. In some cases, we romanticize and fetishize the wild, romantic views of wild horses that imbue them with special powers or beauty, while denying how they actually live and die. Similarly, romanticized views of indigenous peoples often fail to take account of their full lived experiences and histories. On the other hand, while some romanticize wolves, many more through history and still today demonize them and see them as a threat to human life and well-being, again failing to understand how they live and hunt. Similarly, many humans racialized as anything other than white are demonized and seen as a threat to civilized human life. Lauren Eichler has effectively argued that the dehumanization of other humans rests on unquestioned derogatory views of other than human animals. Comparing humans to vermin, moving and killing humans like cattle are just a few examples that supported Germany's view of those humans deemed undesirable, surplus, and killable. Control and elimination of carnivores and other pests during the colonization and settling of the U.S. also served to support and justify similar treatment of Native Americans, slaves, and various groups of immigrants. Deemed a threat to the civilizing efforts of European immigrants who are farming and ranching in the early colonies, both wolves and Native Americans gained a reputation as vicious and violent and faced indiscriminate killing that threatened their continued existence. Even while enjoying some increased protections and efforts at recovery, wolves who are deemed threats to livestock are killed or captured and forced to live in captivity at various sanctuaries. Humans who are deemed threats are killed and captured as well. The perception of threat is augmented by the stereotypes of both the human and the other animals involved. Even without the threat of direct violence, one can come to be seen as threatening enough to justify killing and captivity. Wild horses don't threaten the lives of humans directly, but their perceived competition with livestock and wildlife humans value as prey result in their deaths and captivity. What if we developed other approaches to potential threats and conflicts that are rooted in respect and reciprocity? With just these few examples of the lives of wild horses, you can see the entanglements with the divides between rural and urban politics in the U.S., the historical and present-day treatment of Native Americans, the carceral system in the U.S., tensions between environmental and animal advocacy groups, and tensions within animal advocacy groups. These are all engaged in one or more of the centrisms Plumwood critiques: androcentrism, Eurocentrism, ethnocentrism, and anthropocentrism. One way to decenter the human is to realize all that humans share with other life and to forefront the human dependency on the rest of nature. This both dissolves humans' sense of specialness and separateness and shows the shared condition of being human. I think this requires focusing on humans' embodied being. We eat, poop, pee, lactate, die, are eaten. We have mind and culture, but so too do most, if not all, other animals. Rather than focus on what is uniquely human, focusing on what is shared allows humans to see and appreciate those abilities that make other forms of life unique. This helps to stop the habit of moving from seeing some being as different to seeing them as deficient or inferior. If that habit is mitigated with regard to other animal beings, I think it will be easier to mitigate with respect to other human beings. If the human views of other animals were more respectful, it would remove at least one support for the habit of dehumanization, and it would challenge the notion of being animal-like or wild is to fail to be human. One of the earliest things Western culture teaches children is that other than human animals don't have personality, intelligence, or important social relationships that need to be respected. In short, they don't matter. They are disposable, even many beloved pets. One reason this is seen as important to do is so the unrestrained use of other animal beings as food, clothing, and research objects won't be questioned. Sympathy with other animals is deemed childish and womanish, a weakness, a failure to grow up. This is easily transferred to sympathy with any marginalized, oppressed human group. For the sake of the planet and ourselves, I think we need sympathy with other animal beings to be seen as a mark of moral maturity. Similarly, the concept of being wild needs to be seen as something shared among human and other animal beings. While the current ideas of wild as being the absence of humans seems to decenter the human, it actually perpetuates the human-centered perspective, as an animal's relationship with or disposition toward humans seals its fate as protected or persecuted. Rather than try to understand the wild as separate, we need more relationality. Decentering humans doesn't mean not caring about humans. Rather, it makes real embodied ecological care possible for humans and other living beings. Thank you.
I'm sure you can handle your own questions.
I will. I just want to see if I
What
can.
are those little beasties? The ones with smaller antlers?
The pronghorn antelope?
Pronghorn
Yeah.
antelope.
Yeah.
Pronghorns.
I just couldn't see if we saw the sanctuary horses up there, but we'll see. Questions, thoughts, disagreements? I know it was long, so hopefully everyone's still awake. Or just taking us back to what Lee and Tess talked about with other work. I'm happy to go back to any of those issues too.
I'd be happy for you to answer the questions that Tess was trying to answer. Like, for example, I want to hear more about how the overlapping commitment, how are our commitments different when they're commitments to the wild? And I mean, so you just attacked the word wild in the sense of its misuse, right? Because it's a continuum. But I want to hear more about the difference between our commitments to the wild and our commitments to the human. Blurring the line doesn't help me know what to do next.
Nope. But it hopefully complicates the pattern and habit we've been having. So as I said at the beginning, I'm not going to give you an answer to all these questions, but I'm going to complicate the way we think about them. But I do think it can rule some things out, and some things may become more possible.
Give me
so
some
there can be
examples
some
of stuff that's
examples.
well. No, that's too easy a question. Give me an example of something that I'm allowed to do under specific circumstances that would count as an excuse, well, for eating meat. So, for example, I'll give you an example. There is a backstrap in my freezer of a deer killed under Illinois
rules.
deer killing, given to me by my neighbor. Backstrap's the best part, right? Can I eat that?
Yes. You can also eat the factory farm cow. Different consequences come. And so I think one of the answers Lee gave to the question about animals and facing them, I agree that it's actually probably, it'd be better if you had hunted the deer, quite frankly, in my opinion, before you eat it.
Now, come on. That's not fair.
If you're not willing to kill the animal, should you eat it? So that's a question. So, and Lee kind of posed this. So if one's not willing to participate in some of those things, then one at least has to be asking the question, why am I doing this? There's a great book called Every 12 Seconds, where Timothy Pratt talks about dirty work. And anytime there's a dirty job that you wouldn't want to do yourself, but activities you participate in require someone do that, you should ask if you're really morally allowed to do that. So would you be willing to do the work in the slaughterhouse? If not, you should not be asking someone else to do it. If you're willing to hunt, and maybe you are willing to hunt, then you have to ask the question of whether you're willing. You should eat it.
I can't kill Bambi, but I can eat Bambi. And you're telling me that's a performative contradiction.
I think it's reason to pause and think about what you are and aren't doing. I also don't think we can move to hunting. So everyone says, well, if we all hunted our food and didn't have factory farms, then everything would be better. No, because we can't sustain that either given our current numbers, so the population issue comes back. So you're going to have to do different things. And then I'd also want to know, a little bit more about how that particular deer was hunted and why. You know, they're different things. Would I eat it? Under what circumstances? So I would have been vegetarian for a long time, and my nephew, who was, I think, 9 or 10 at the time, they picked me up at the Seattle airport, and he said, Aunt Erin, I have a trout. I caught it. I killed it quickly. Will you eat my fish? And I ate his fish. Because he had heard me, he had understood, he'd been thinking about it, and that way we could continue a conversation. I would probably not do that with him now when he's 40-something, but at the time,
That was the last time you had a fish, right?
so I think you do have to think about what are the contradictions, what are you asking other people to do on your behalf, what are you wanting to make sure you don't have to see or be a part of, and engage in some serious questioning, both as an individual, but then as a society. We have to do that. It can't just be individual by individual, but we've set up systems so you don't have to do that. Is that related?
One of the things along that line, one of the things I thought about there is, so it seems like there are different, I'm not sure how to say it, like different people have different gifts. So I'm thinking about like my friend that I went hunting with, he is clearly meant to be a hunter. It's like he has that capacity. He's one of those types of guys where it's like that's where he thrives, he comes alive, and it's like him and the deer, and there's like this magic, right? And I went along with him.
You were there.
Because I was like, I wanted to see if I'm able to do something like that. And I think I would be able to do it if push came to shove, but I don't have that same, the word that comes to mind in Mexican Spanish is a don. You know, it's like I don't have that gift that he does. But I can grow a pumpkin like he cannot, you know? And so it's like, there's something there that I can do that he can't. And so is there a sharing or a trading that can be, you know, it's like my respect for his gift, his respect for my gift, where there can be an exchange, where even though I can't step into his shoes and do what he does, I can still, you know, share in what he does in a way that's respectful of it.
And probably even better for the animal, because learning to be a good hunter often causes a lot of pain for the animal.
Yeah.
But if you were unwilling to ever go see it happen, then I might have more questions.
Yeah.
But you were willing to go participate. So yeah, I don't think we all have to be able to do each and everything. But if we are unwilling to look at what's something we need done to support our habits, then I think we have to be asking some serious questions. And I've slaughtered chickens. The rabbits were probably the final straw. Sheep, but I'm not willing to do it, so.
I'd like to say thanks first for sharing your ongoing research.
Thank you.
And you've given us some really nice taxonomic structures or perhaps better functions to kind of hang further thought on. I do have a practical problem for you. This is a real one. It's not a thought experiment. I live about 25 miles southeast of here in the Shawnee National Forest. It's a subdivision, very foresty, of about 80 homes. And a lot of professors live there, very progressive. We have an area where prairie wildflowers and indigenous plants, native plants are being tested. Now, what we do have also is an overpopulation of deer.
Correct.
In fact, last evening, they got through my fence and ate my ochre plants. I'm not holding them against that, against them. But the question is, harvesting with firearms is not really an option
Because of the houses.
because of all the houses. Even bow hunting would be
Dangerous.
dangerous. So, give me something I can take to the board.
So there's birth control. There's a lot of deer birth control being tried now. So
This would mean catching the deer.
Nope, you dart them, and they last 2 to 3 years depending on the kind of birth control, and they can even keep track of which does have been darted. I don't know the costs for that part. I've not looked into that. But yeah, you can definitely do birth control. Now, the problem is you live in a big area, so the whole Shawnee National Forest would have to adopt some form of birth control to help your little subdivision.
Precisely.
But they probably may want to do that anyway, because there may be if they're overpopulated, they're probably harming other trees and things that they want
they're
in the
harming
forest.
themselves
So.
because they're overpopulated.
Right. So I would say a form of birth control, and it has been tried, especially in cities where hunting is not a good option. Because they used to send people in to hunt in some pretty crowded cities, and it's not a great idea. So advocates have argued for birth control for deer
It's not unusual in Carbondale to see deer
everywhere.
more or less in the middle of the city,
Yep.
munching on people's lawns.
Yep, and during hunting season, they get a little more agitated and run in front of cars at a higher rate usually, so. Yeah, that's the only thing I can think of practically,
Well,
would be
take your
birth
suggestion
control.
to the,
Yay!
oh, I did have another question. You gave us a very rich taxonomy, distinctions that we should perhaps take into consideration. But there was one that I think you kind of slipped past faster than I could get my head around it, and that was the composite.
Oh, I think I didn't, did I not talk about?
The compositional wildness.
Oh,
Compositional, yeah.
what would have been the native species in the area? So you're like talking about the plants in your area and what species would have been there. Now there probably used to be wolves or someone who were eating the deer.
Yeah.
And so you've lost compositional wildness because some animals have been taken out. If we were to reintroduce wolves to your area to help bring down the deer population, you would retain compositional wildness because you'd have all the species back, but you would lose other kinds of wildness.
Yeah, okay.
Like historical, because now it's humans brought the wolves back. So you lost historical, but you regained compositional.
Okay, thank you.
But
you
the problem with
oppose
that,
reductive wildness.
yes.
Okay.
And I worry about all these categories because composition at what point in time? You have to arbitrarily pick the time that these species were there, and then it can become static and stuck. Things do change. We know that we were a cause of a lot of those changes, especially with predator eradication. So that may require some obligations on our part to help restore, which is why I think we have ethical obligations to domesticated animals, to feral animals, to what we consider wild animals now, all of the above. But what I really would like to do is blur those lines more. So as you were talking about, many people who want to talk about animal ethics think it is only wild animals that we have any obligations to because domesticated animals are polluted.
Yeah.
They are deformed. They are bad. And I don't, as a pragmatist, I don't see that. That was human interaction with their environment that led to domestication. It's probably a lot of coevolution going on. Have we done bad things to domesticated animals? Absolutely. Are many of our relationships unethical? Yes, but I don't think domestication is somehow a defect. And I don't think wildness gives you privilege, but that's our laws right now. So what do you do with that? And then, it's the hard thing I'm saying with chimpanzees. Do I advocate for horses to get wild status so they'd be protected under the Endangered Species Act? Well, if I do that, I'm reifying the binaries that I don't want, but I want to protect them. So
That's the same problem that prairie restorationists have. At what point in time
Right.
do we target? Yeah.
And are you
That's
going
a
to
hard
allow the
question.
prairie dogs back?
Yeah.
Because prairie dogs are in big trouble all over. Yep. And it's mostly what is a nuisance to humans and some aesthetic we have or some part of our lifestyle that we want. And that's, I don't think enough of a reason. But
So you oppose essentializing of almost all kinds, right? Except that sometimes there are practical exceptions. Well, you never get to essentialize, but what you could do is you can act as if
right.
something were essentialized.
So it's kind of like with the chimpanzees, they do something like the Great Ape Project. They try and argue for, I'm not an animal rights person, so I don't really go up for rights, but they want to argue for rights for chimpanzees and orangutans because they're so like humans. Now, practically in a court of law, that's probably going to be the way that works, right, to get them some protection. So I don't really want to oppose that. But if that happens, it reinforces that only large-brained social mammals are going to get any consideration, and the pigs and the dogs and everyone else, the wolves, are not. So it's a practical concern. Do I go out and go after the people in the Great Ape Project? No. Am I signing on? No. I'm trying to work for other conceptual changes that might move us in another direction. But my worry is my thing is longer term, because we have to change people's ways of thinking, and there will be no chimpanzees left by the time my stuff gets done. So I'm not willing to oppose the more practical work being done, even if it conceptually bothers me.
So it seems like there's just a tension between the short term, what's effective and necessary and urgent right now, which is that we do something, and weigh in some ways to make lives better right now, while still pursuing the conceptual clarity that might make longer term transformations in people more wide scale. So we have to use the language of wild and feral because that's what already exists, that's the world that we're in, that's what policy is looking for, but that doesn't mean you're stuck there either. You can work to push past it at the same time. But if we just introduce a whole new term and then expect policymakers to be like, oh, that's useful, thanks, it's
Not going to happen.
seems to not be what's welcome.
Yep.
There's a difference between wild and experiential terms, almost literary, right? I mean, so it's not just a word, but it's a word that sort of gloms on to experiences that a lot of people have, and wild not only as a legal but as a sort of a functional. I mean, is that deer in my yard yesterday?
Yes.
Day before yesterday. Is it wild?
So it's like the squirrel, right?
Yeah, it's more like a squirrel.
Or the hawks.
Right?
But
like,
no, but the squirrel's wild too,
the
unless you're
squirrel's
really
wild
feeding
too,
it.
Right, it's wild-ish. Or wild. In other words,
See?
wild but dear to us. As opposed to the wolf, which is wild and
The wolf is not going to hurt you any more than the squirrel or the deer in most cases.
if I see a wolf in my yard,
I back away.
somebody's
but-
getting a call. Not necessarily
call
because
us.
I'm afraid. I'm as much afraid for
For
the
the wolf. If it's
as
in
of
right,
the
right. If they're in with the humans, there's
like,
reason to
the
get them out of
wolf
there.
here is like there should not be a wolf here, right? The wolves
So-
should be elsewhere, not here.
So in Oregon, we just had a couple wolves run over, and we have people who've intentionally poisoned wolves in Oregon pretty regularly, and we've had some accidental running overs that don't appear so accidental, but these cases did. And when they found out people were feeding the wolves out of their cars in this particular community, so they created the conditions for the wolves to get run over by the cars. And the people were then reporting these wolves are walking up to the cars and they're showing no fear of humans. I'm like, well, yeah, that would be it. But in fact, wolves wouldn't care one way or another about us have we not done all the things we've done to them. So they tend to avoid us. They're not really, but they're not hunting us. They're not aggressive unless things have happened. So we have to think about what are we doing and how do we share space. And some animals we can share space with easier than others and more people are willing to. But like I said, the ranchers aren't going to allow an increase in the mountain lion population, even if it brings down the wild horse population, which they want brought down because of their cattle. But there are ways to do predator management. Washington has a great wolf program, and you have to employ non-lethal methods before any questioning of lethal methods can be employed. You have to remove any dead
Washington
animals.
has a great wolf program.
Wolf management.
Could you give me a little wolf management?
So the wolf advisory.
That sounds evil. Wolf management.
No, so it is. It actually brings together the wildlife, fish and wildlife people, ranchers, hunters, animal advocates, regular citizens, all on a wolf advisory group, and they advise and they came up with rules. So they didn't outlaw lethal means, so that would have taken the ranchers out, but the ranchers have to do certain things before lethal means can be taken, and Fish and Wildlife helps them do that. They have range riders, they have flags, they can do lights, there's all sorts of stuff, but they have to be cleaning up any dead calf or something like that, anything that would attract a wolf, so it's not all or nothing. And it was when the profanity pack was eliminated, animal advocates were very upset, and the Wolf Advisory Council is like, we're upset too, but had you not done that, all the wolves would be eradicated again by now, because the ranchers aren't going to put up with nothing being done. So it's a great experiment on working democratically together. And the first Wolf Advisory group I attended online was a little tense, and then they brought in a mediator, which they'd had in the past, because it is so tense, especially between hunters and sometimes hunters and ranchers, but hunters and animal advocates and wolf sanctuary leaders. But they really took democratic principles, respect in the conversation. How do you do that in a community having to come together, knowing they'll never all agree? No one's ever going to get everything they want, but the wolves have no chance if these humans don't learn to work across differences. The biggest failing is, I think that they keep claiming that they can't have a Native American representative because the Native American group has a whole separate council regarding various wildlife in Washington. But they need to have a representative on the wolf advisory group. So I'm hoping that might change. But I think they're an example. Oregon's doing nothing like that. Colorado's about to reintroduce wolves, and I hope they've contacted Washington and Oregon for wolves. I don't know how that's going to go, but they have apparently been in touch about the wolf advisory group in Washington, and I hope they come up with some kind of model. So it can't be all or nothing, even with something that is potentially dangerous. But wolves, the mountain lion is much more dangerous to you than the wolf. But more people are scared of the wolf than the mountain lion. And I don't want to then, pit them against each other. 'Cause I've got mountain lions in my area.
Last Summer Institute. We were walking back in the dark and heard this out of a
And you
tree.
could see their eyes.
And the eyes are peering through the thing.
Did it get a philosopher of some kind? What kind?
No, we made it. But I had asked we should drive across the street. They said, "Oh no, that's silly." And then after that, we drove
I
across the
got my
street.
headlamp. That'll be so
We have them
easy.
here again, by the way. The mountain lions have made their way back from the Shawnees.
So the thing is, we live with them without knowing it. So they have documented, coyotes are in every city, right? And big cats are in most places. We don't see them. They do.
They
So
don't
in
like to hang with us.
They don't. But in the Northwest, there is a biker or a hiker killed almost every year. So it's a real threat. But this is where I'm with Plumwood, we need to learn to live with some of that threat. We are not somehow inviolate. And when we're in certain places, and it will be a shame and people will mourn, but it is not like some moral wrong for an animal to see us as food. And usually the human has done something inadvertently maybe, but that triggers that. And so more education, more understanding of the species. But we had people who moved out to my area recently, and they inherited goats with the house, and they never put them up at night. And they say a cougar killed 3 goats, which seems unusual to me. They usually would kill one and eat it, but they hired a hunter, and the hunter claims he got the cougar. I'm like, you got a cougar? I don't know. And they still aren't putting the remaining goats up at night. So they did nothing to mitigate their behavior or do anything. It's just the cougar's fault. That's human arrogance. But I'm thinking maybe they all have little dogs. They might move out of the area if there's another cougar issue. So we'll see. Because the little dogs are shut up. The goats are not, but the little dogs are
Sounds like maybe they need to go back to Portland.
somewhere.
It was a fun experiment living.
This is my whole thing with the hawks.
Yeah.
Right, so the hawks are wild, and you are in shared space. It is their home, and it is your home, and you are, as you said, you're feeling honored. But lots of people would probably run them off if they didn't like to see the killing or do something. But
Screams.
I don't think so. This is an interesting one. I was asking, like, what if they overhunted his backyard and were hungry? Would he provision the babies? I don't think you are obligated to do that. I don't also think you're always prohibited. Usually feeding wildlife is a bad idea. So we have bears in Eugene all the time because everyone feeds birds. And the bears come to the bird feeders and then get relocated a couple times and then shot. And I'm just like, stop eating the birds. They don't need it. And the bears would be fine. But we're not the brightest species.
But it challenges all of us to come up with like new habits of how to share space. And you were saying like, well, I need to watch out for my own kitten then, if this is going to be a shared space, and if not, maybe this isn't the place for someone. Or sometimes there might be, you have to take some measure, but you've tried all of these other things.
Do you let the rest of the neighborhood know there is a hawk so they take care of their small animals, or no? I mean, we all know we
No,
have
but
them.
they know.
Yeah.
It's loud.
They're loud.
Okay.
We call Lee your hawks.
I actually got that call
Oh, you did?
from the neighbor.
It's
He
loud.
sent me a picture. He's like,
Would you
"They're on
shut these
they're on
up?"
your deck again."
Yeah. Would you shut these hawks up?
Seriously.
McBride,
No one calls the police for noise complaints or
no, it's complaining. It's like McBride's hawks are at it again.
I don't know. They're on your back porch.
Well, I know I'm keeping people from replenishing drinks and things, so I'm happy to talk to people individually too,
All right.
rather than
Oh, okay.
stand. I don't know what time it is, but I just don't want to keep
Yeah,
people
well,
from
there's
drinking.
no hurry. Nobody has to go anywhere except where you have to go. It's actually that was her talk. I just summarized it. I'm not sure about necessity in the wild, but what I am sure is that we're not very wild here, and there's not much necessity either.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, thank you
Thank
for
you.
having us. It's been fun.